The past few months have seen increased diplomatic activity between Japan and South Korea on a scale not seen in years. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida have visited each other's countries, and senior defense officials met just last week in Singapore. Diplomatic engagement that appears to have sizable support, according to a survey, especially among young people. And culture appears to be at the core of that engagement.
Outraged protests, product boycotts, and national trade disputes. Relations between Japan and South Korea have been on the rocks in recent years. Now, this flamboyant Korean comedian is leading a cultural turnaround.
I'm Tanaka, the most popular Japanese in South Korea.
Kim Kyung-Wook's Japanese alter ego Tanaka has helped to lighten the mood between these two neighbours, with songs and jokes.
For young people like us, we don't think about reasons to be friends. We just become friends. I never thought about those reasons. We don't become friends with someone because they have certain good qualities, but because we're the same people.
His sympathetic portrayal has become an online hit. He has 800,000 subscribers on YouTube, tuning in to watch Tanaka devour Korean snacks, and thousands paying to see him live in person on stage. His die-hard fans say his success has done much to heal the historic rift in recent years.
I have enjoyed Japanese culture since I was young. I hope people aren't so narrow-minded about Japan and hope it can be an opportunity to unite.
There is a social atmosphere that sort of encouraged boycotting of Japanese culture. So I was reluctant to talk about Japan. However, after Tanaka's debut on YouTube, the atmosphere is more relaxed.
The fallout between the two countries goes back to the era of Japanese colonial rule, and in particular, the exploitation of women. Women like Lee Young-soon, who were forced into sexual slavery in the 1940s.
They must apologize and provide compensation by thoroughly examining the comfort women issue. Who ran military brothels? Japan did.
Animosity that turned into trade disputes at the national level and sweeping boycotts of goods. Beer, fashion and tech brands all in the firing line. That's changed now, with Japan's Asahi Brew back in favour again, much to the pleasure of beer lovers.
If there's something to apologize for, it's right to get an apology from Japan. But I think we don't need to be hung up on that and treat them badly. As neighboring countries, our young people hope that we'll get along well with each other.
If these foes are indeed becoming friends again, it's no small thanks to the healing power of culture.
And joining me now for more context is John Lee. He's an editor at Korea Pro, a website focused on South Korea's foreign and domestic affairs. John, what role would you say is culture playing in bringing young people from South Korea and Japan closer?
Well, we have to consider that culture has always been a very important part between Korea and Japan. Japanese movies, Japanese pop songs, animated comic books, these have always been very popular in Korea. And recently, with a slight thaw in the relations between the two countries, younger Koreans especially have been more willing to purchase Japanese clothes, Japanese food, Japanese brands in general. And so this is helping to improve relations somewhat between on a people-to-people level.
Relations between South Korea and Japan have always been overshadowed by the Japanese occupation of Korea that ended with the end of World War II. Is that at all relevant to how younger South Koreans perceive Japan?
Well, I wouldn't say that it is completely absent. While younger South Koreans might not be as invested in the past events as older generations might be, it's always still there. And so whether you're talking about the war crimes or the occupation that Japan conducted in Korea in the first half of the 20th century. All of that is still part of South Korean history curriculums. And so that will never totally disappear. It might have weakened, but it will never be gone completely.
We're talking about young people. Let's talk about the leaders of both countries who've met frequently in the past few months alone and talked of improving ties. What's behind this rapprochement?
Well, let's start with the South Korean president. President Yoon Suk-yeol is a little different from most other conventional politicians. Whereas most politicians would be very in tune and concerned about their approval ratings, President Yoon Suk-yeol relatively doesn't seem to care all that much. He is very much an idealist. He is driven by his idealism, and his ideals dictates that he needs to pursue a closer relationship with the Western countries, with the democracies of the world, and that includes Japan. And so he is convinced that pursuing détente with Japan is the right thing to do, and so that's where he's at right now. As when we cross the Sea of Japan and talk about Fumio Kishida, he is much more cautious in approaching his relations with South Korea. We have to remember that he was the foreign minister at the time when former President Park Geun-hye and former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came up with this supposedly final and irreversible deal to oversee the comfort women problems that occurred in the past. And so because he was a Japanese foreign minister at the time who pushed Shinzo Abe to pursue this deal with South Korea, he has been burned before when South Korea suddenly turned around and decided that those deals were no longer relevant. And so whereas he is reciprocating President Yoon Suk-yeol's olive branch, he might not be as gung-ho about it.
But are there any geostrategic needs that are more pressing this time round that brings Japan and South Korea together?
Most certainly, but with the rise of China and China becoming more assertive, and with the rise of wolf warrior diplomacy, as people around the world have seen over the past few years, there have been a lot of concerns about China's rising assertiveness in the region, and because South Korea and Japan have a lot of have a lot of commonalities when it comes to industries, and they are competing against China right now. And of course, because they are siding a lot with the U.S. and there's a lot of heated back and forth between Washington and Beijing, Seoul and Tokyo, especially under the current governments, have the impetus, they have the needed motivation to try to get closer together. But whether or not this is going to be a long-term sort of factor that will help, that will keep relations improving in perpetuity, that's a different matter altogether. Because we have to remember that China has always been there. Whether we're talking about 5, 10, or 12 years ago, China has been a rising economy. But in the past, South Korea and Japan have still turned away from each other despite the rising China at the time as well. So will this continue? That remains to be seen.
What should we be looking out for in the coming months?
And in the coming months, South Korea is going to have a domestic election, a parliamentary election. And if you look at the polls right now, a majority of South Koreans say that they expect the opposition party to maintain control of the National Assembly. Now, that is extremely bad news for President Yoon Suk-yeol, because if the Democrats, if the opposition party, the Democratic Party, if they maintain control of the National Assembly, President Yoon's domestic policies are going to be just stuck for the rest of his presidential term. And so he is going to have to try to get his numbers up. Now, will he try to be more assertive toward Japan if he feels that his approval ratings are not going up high enough that he feels comfortable with next year's elections? Then things might change. So far, he has not indicated that he will, but in politics, it's anyone's guess.